Well, thank you. I have one fan. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the, fifth presentation in the 2008-2009 Science Technology Society program, the Linus Pauling Memorial Lectures. My name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and we are an institute that organizes this with the help of our partners, and it is my pleasure now to say thank you to the partners. So Mentor Graphics Corporation has been our main corporate co-sponsor for a number of years now. Can we give them a big hand? Yes. And then close behind them for many years, I'm going to just go down this list. Oregon Episcopal School, FEI Company, the Oregon University System, which is primarily the Chancellor's Office. He may need some encouragement for next year with all this. But he says maybe. So. Portland State University, University of Oregon, Western Oregon University, where we're going to be tomorrow as well. Dr. Haack will be down there. Portland Community College, Mount Hood Community College, Clark College in Vancouver, and Onami, which is our nanotech future here. FLIR Systems, it's our infrared guys who are really good. Lewis and Clark College, Pacific University, and thank you to Oregonian. And then finally, the Mentor Graphics, besides Mentor Graphics Corporation support, we've got a grant from Mentor Graphics Foundation that subsidizes the tickets for the K-12 program. So thank you to them very much too. And you will note also in your program on the inside that the that OSU Brain Awareness lecture series, which we kind of like to co-produce with them or co-market, and a great program. And the next one's coming up. When is the next one? The 16th. If you've been to any of those, they're great. Okay, so cell phone double check. You will be the giant laser, like zeroes in on anybody who. One of those goes off and you get burned anyway a little bit from the laser. So, or something. Either that or your person next to you is going to nail you. Okay, so I've grabbed the opportunity to do the introduction tonight partly because Susan Haack is relatively close to my background, my field, although she has, in fact, considerable divergence, but she's had a tremendous influence on philosophy of science, and taken that into a very interesting area, which is the law, and asked questions about what is the relationship between evidence and reasoning in science and evidence and reasoning in the law. And I believe that both science and the law have benefited considerably from her very sensible analysis and reflection, and then actually getting involved in looking at cases where, like the Dover, evolution, whatever those guys were trying to do in Dover case. And anyway, so she's very well, I want to say, probably one of the best recognized philosophers of her generation. Being a woman, that's something, but whether she completely gender neutral, she is simply hugely influential. She writes these excellent articles and essays that are short and pithy and to the point, and that have tremendous influence and are reprinted again and again and again in anthologies. And one of the books, the Putting Philosophy to Work, is kind of one of my favorites. It's a collection of relatively recent essays that just out. We had to actually get them drop shipped here. Anyway, so that's a little bit of background. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She did her undergraduate degree at Oxford. She's English. Did her undergraduate degree in Oxford. Her doctorate at Cambridge. She was started as a fellow of Newhall in Cambridge, 68 to 71. Then she accepted an appointment at the University of Warwick, starting as a lecturer in 71, promoted a reader in 76. We don't know. Lecturer, readers are like assistant professor, associate professor. Anyway, so she's a full professor there in 1982 and taught there until 1990. In 1990, Maisie moves to the University of Miami, where she is presently. And she's presently the distinguished professor in the humanities, the Cooper Senior Scholar in Arts and Sciences, a professor in the philosophy department, professor of law, Professor Haack's diversity is reflected in the fact that she teaches for the philosophy department, also interdisciplinary course for the College of Arts and Sciences, and courses for the law school. So it gives you a sense of the range of her influence. So the diversity continues, though. In 1997-98, she was a Phi Beta Kappa professor of philosophy, and in the course of her career, she's held visiting professorships at the University of Guelph in Canada, University of Cape Town in South Africa, University of Virginia, University of Santiago in Spain, Aarhus University in Denmark, I'm probably mispronouncing that, and University of Bologna in Italy. Yes, Italy, Bologna. In addition, she had a fellowship for research at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University and a Harkness fellowship at Princeton. So she's been in great demand and has quite a considerable exposure globally. She's author of a number of books. Particularly early on, it was about logic, reasoning and evidence, ranging from the formal to the informal, and how evidence is portrayed and understood in the sciences, and then also in the legal context, as I mentioned. A few of her books, an early book that I first read is called Deviant Logic, where she challenges what was dominant, and she and I were sharing stories, war stories of being taught formal logic and, in fact, teaching formal logic in the university, of which we were not particularly happy. Well, Susan was sharp enough to really go after it and challenge what was being taught and to ask serious questions about how reasoning worked within science and how it worked in different arenas. In fact, her second book, one of her second books, Philosophy of Logics, she outlined and documented the diversity of contexts in which we reason and how there's not like one formal logic that overrides everything. And all these were tremendously influential because well, I won't go into it all. Anyways, tremendously influential. I don't have to explain it out. You want a short lecture here? No. Anyway, she had another book called Evidence and Enquiry Towards a Reconstruction in Epistemology. And here she's broadening out into the philosophy of science area and saying, what are we really doing in science? What is a fact, and what are theories, and all these things, and how do we know, and what is inquiry really? And I mean, a lot of people were asking these questions, but Susan is known for being extremely sharp, focused, and pithy, and I think you'll see that in tonight's lecture about this. Then she also has one other book, which I love, which we tried to get, but I didn't get it. It's called, it's a famous book called Manifesto of a Passionate Moderate. Unfashionable essays. And passionate moderate, it kind of reflects a lot of what she's done. When she's too extreme, she tends to go the middle route and find a little bit of what is good on each side, and then see the good in each of them and develop it into a more reasonable common ground. So most related to tonight's presentation and her work in the treatment of science in the classroom, she has a book which you can buy out there called Defending Science Within Reason. Okay, Defending Science / Within Reason, Between Science and Cynicism, in which she really goes into trying to understand what is science and how does it fit into the broader human context. Another very important contribution of hers, which I love because it's something that I agree with and think we're going, is there's an indigenous American philosophy called American pragmatism. And somehow, when I was going to college, I thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I was very, very interested in it. And yet, somehow, it wasn't getting taught in the universities, and we were all kind of wondering about that and why, and that's a whole other story. But Susan Haack is one of those people who went back and grabbed it and developed it and has become, I think, one of the best, if not the best, current developer and explicator of the American philosophical tradition that goes back to William James and Charles Sanders Peirce and such people. So she has a book that's, I think it's out there, there's a few copies, called Pragmatism Old and New, which is extremely good. And this is, in my mind, the future. American pragmatism is going to come back. It's much smarter than a lot of the stuff that we imported from Europe that I got, crammed down my throat back in the old days. Anyway, I'm rambling here. So, okay, the new book I mentioned, Putting Philosophy to Work. This is an interesting thing. I'm going to mention one other thing. Putting philosophy to work. Just that concept. A lot of people think philosophy is just like this abstract, like, oh, let's, have a couple of beers and talk about philosophy. Susan has been very, very instrumental in bringing philosophy down and saying, no, this is real stuff, and this is where it matters, and here's the practical consequences of looking at things this way or that way, and what do we do about multiple ways of looking at things and such, okay? So that's a great book that's really in this American pragmatist tradition, which is, you know, feet on the ground philosophy. Where are we going? What are we doing? And I'm going to skip. There's a whole, she published a whole bunch of articles and various things, which I won't read, all that stuff. So, having built completely unreasonable expectations about her, I will now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Haack.
Thank you, Tim. I thought you must be tired of that one by now. I'd like to thank Terry very much for inviting me. This is the second time in my life I've been in Oregon. The last time was in 1976. Truth to tell, I'm enjoying this one a lot more. What I'm trying to do this evening is to get you to think about the scientific enterprise, what it does, what it can do, and also about what its limits are. I've always been very fond of this picture. It actually comes from a Citibank ad, but it is their caption. I like it very much. Knowledge is power. Feel free to stretch. That's what I'd like you to do. That's what I shall encourage you to do. I'm going to begin, probably rather unusually in this series, by reading you a poem. It's a poem that's familiar to every British child, at least every British child of my generation. As you'll soon learn, it's a poem inspired, I think, by the era of British rule in India. But it's also a poem from which we can learn, I think, a great deal. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "Bless me, it seems the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of his tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here, so very round and smooth and sharp? To me it is mighty clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, he boldly up and spake. "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth stretched out his eager hand and felt about the knee. "What most this mighty beast is like is mighty plain," quoth he. "'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "Even the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can. This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no longer had begun about the beast to grope, than, seizing on its swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," cried he, "the elephant is very like a rope. Let's see their elephant." Very like a wall, very like a snake, very like a spear, very like a rope, very like a fan. But it's not quite an elephant, is it? I'm going to try gradually to build up a real elephant. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. That, I guess, is, I think, the moral of the story of the science wars, which is where I'll begin. I'll be relatively brief about what these events were. The period is mid to late 1990s. And what happened, I think, was that disciplines which for a long time had really hardly spoken to each other suddenly became aware of what the other side was saying and began to be really quite concerned. On the one hand, we have the science critics. most of these people came from, actually from relatively new disciplines. SSK stands for Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, STS for Science and Technology Studies. A lot of these people also came from cultural studies, discipline that seems to me to have, not to be without merit, but I do kind of understand that rather unkind joke that says, well, you know, cultural studies had to be invented so there was something for sociologists to look down on. Also among the science critics, there were environmentalists concerned about possible bad environmental effects of things that the sciences were making possible. Feminists who were feeling sort of shut out and as if science wasn't really taking them as seriously as it should. And of course, postmodernists of various stripes who were very skeptical about ideas like truth and inquiry, and hence about science as a form of inquiry seeking truth. And on the other hand, there were science supporters, including a relatively small number of scientists who were willing and able to read this stuff and to respond to it. And some philosophers of science, though I think, I would say many of my colleagues, while this was going on, had their heads pretty much in the sand. I might say, in the early 90s, while this was beginning to warm up, was reading material on feminist philosophy of science and feeling deeply uneasy. Not, of course, at all inclined to deny that for a very long time, talented women found it very difficult to get into science and to do the work that they were good at. But really very troubled by the idea that somehow if science had been done by women, it would be a whole different enterprise. And somehow this didn't seem very convincing to me, but that was the first thing I began to worry about. The science critics said, science is anti-democratic. Well, in a sense, yes. There would be something really very bizarre, I think, about trying to decide what scientific theory is the best one on this and that area by taking a vote. In another sense, though, I think, at least in the ideal, science is kind of democratic in this sense, that what matters, or what ought to matter, what does matter when things are going well, is how good, how plausible someone's idea is, how well it stands up to evidence, and not what his position is. You shouldn't, in principle, get to say what the scientific truth is in virtue of your position as the Muckety-Muck professor of whatever it is at Harvard. It doesn't work that way. If you happen to be Jim Watson and brash as can be and only 24, but hang it, you've got it right, then you got it right, and Linus Pauling has to concede. Science is value-laden and politically regressive. My unease about that, I think, is to be sure science is value-laden. I think that epistemological values are absolutely inherent in the scientific enterprise. I'm more concerned that why does everybody think the only values there are political values? There are lots of kinds of values. Epistemological, ethical, aesthetic, prudential, economic, spiritual, legal. I thought that I was beginning to feel the stress on political values was a little overdone. Science is socially constructed. Well, I want to say yes and no. We'll get there in due course. And potentially dangerous. Well, yes. Knowledge is power, and power can be abused, but that doesn't strike me as a reason for not seeking it. The science supporters replied, the two phrases in quotation marks are actual quotations from a book I'll speak about shortly, that science is a reliable, profound, and productive source of knowledge, that it's a reality-driven enterprise, that it's a rational enterprise and in some sense subjective, and that scientific discoveries are potentially liberating. All true, if rightly understood. All questionable, if taken, as it were, as an expression simply of faith in anything that wears the label science. Perhaps I may say something personal on the subject of potentially liberating. I'm sure this affects my attitude to science. Were it not for my contact lenses, I would be legally blind. I actually know someone who can see about as much, that's to say about as little, as I can see without my contacts. But unhappily, her problem is in her brain and not in her eyes. And she is legally blind. So I would be legally blind if it weren't for my contact lenses. On the other hand, had there been vaccination against the measles when I was a small child, I wouldn't have needed the contact lenses. This does make me see that science has been liberating for me. My life would be different if I couldn't be made to see by contacts. Well, these issues, it turns out, were by no means new. I guess I'm getting to an age where I'm starting to reread books that I read many years ago and finding that I'd forgotten what wonderful things there were in there. A book I recently reread was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And there I found this, which I'd completely forgotten. This is The Controller. I'm interested in truth. I like science. But truth's a menace. Science is a public danger. It's curious to read what people in the time of our Ford used to write about scientific progress. Do you know this book? Do you remember? The dates run from the year of our Ford, not the year of our Lord. They seem to have imagined that knowledge was the highest good, truth the supreme value. That was written in 1932. When Paul Gross and Norman Levitt published their book in 1994, what they thought they were doing was responding to critics who were hostile to science. They didn't think they were starting something. They thought they were responding to something. I must say, every now and then, it strikes me that this whole debate bears a certain eerie resemblance to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And one of the eerie resemblances is that each side says that the other started it. Well, maybe, I think in hindsight, looking back at the title and especially the subtitle of this book, perhaps they shouldn't have been quite as surprised as they were to find that this was regarded as awful provocation. What a terrible attack on cultural studies and STS and SSK and all that. The academic left and its quarrels with science. I think the reference to the academic left was probably unfortunate, but I know what they were thinking. They are, both of them, especially Norm Levitt, politically concerned, and Norm especially, of the left. And I think he in particular was very, very worried that the idea was getting about that it was somehow politically conservative to appreciate what science can do. As I say, it's like a lot like the Arab-Israeli conflict. Gross and Levitt would say, but you've been sending missiles across our border on a regular basis for years. We can't put up with it any longer. But the critics said, no, you've just started a war. And it was they who called these events the science wars. And in 1996, they fought back with a special issue of a journal called Social Text, devoted to the science wars. Unfortunately, their thunder was stolen up to a point by Professor Sokal. I don't know if you've heard of the Sokal hoax, but if you haven't, I should tell you about it. Professor Sokal is a physics professor at NYU who wrote a paper, ostensibly a piece of science criticism, full of allusions to physics and to physical theories of various esoteric kinds. Anyone who was trained in physics who read this would know that it was bullshit from beginning to end. However, the editors of social text, of course, were not trained in physics and were unwise enough not to give this paper to somebody who was trained in physics to referee, and published it. Sokal, of course, the very same week, revealed the hoax. It was clever, it was funny. I think it's rather unfortunate that it seems to have absorbed Professor Sokal's life from then on. I'm not sure it's not what I would have wanted if I were he. Well, the defenders fought back, and this time I was actually marginally involved. They fought back with a conference at the New York Academy of Sciences called The Flight from Science and Reason. And I was involved in an early planning meeting. At this early planning meeting, I said, at first quietly, and then when nobody listened, a little more loudly, and then a third time, a little impatiently, you know, I wish you wouldn't call this the flight from science and reason, as if science owned reason. Science was the unique locus of the reasonable, the thoughtful, even the inquiring. We all know that that's not true. Science has been a remarkably successful cognitive enterprise, but it's not the only cognitive enterprise in which human beings have engaged, and it's not the only successful one either. Well, you know, I said this quietly, and then I said it louder, and then probably the third time I was sounding a little shrill, and nobody paid the slightest attention. Perhaps the New York Academy of Sciences preferred the title this way round, but anyway, I tried, I failed. The book, which is a remarkable mixture, I think, of thoughtful, good stuff and not so thoughtful, not so good stuff, in due course appeared. And I, rather than continue to fight on either side in the science wars, decided, no, sorry, I want to do something different. I want to think about that elephant, because I'm getting the feeling that the one party says it's very like a wall, and indeed it is very like a wall. But the other party has noticed that bits of it are like a snake, like a rope, like a tree, like a spear, like a fad. And it is, in certain respects, like that. I want to try to write a book that will describe the whole elephant. That was when I began writing Defending Science. I wanted to draw to your attention that my title is deliberately ambiguous. That was not an accident. As a matter of fact, I wrote the book, and then I spent weeks and weeks and weeks figuring out what the right title should be, and then even longer figuring out the subtitle. Finally got the subtitle on the very last day. I mean, the day such that the publisher says, I have to have an answer today. And I finally did it in desperation. Okay, the book is called Defending Science Within Reason. That's a deliberate ambiguity. Within reason means, in one sense, in a reasonable way, to a reasonable degree. I wanted to defend the pretensions of science to tell us things about how the world is, but not to suggest that everything that every scientist ever said was true, for example. I also wanted to defend science as a part of human cognitive activity, as a kind of inquiry recognizably continuous with other kinds of inquiry. So that ambiguity was intentional. And my subtitle, which, as I said, I came up with at the very last minute, and I still like it, but every time somebody says it to me, I think, it's a good job I still have my own teeth between scientism and cynicism. What do I mean by scientism? Well, the first thing to notice is that the word is intentionally pejorative. If someone's scientistic, that's a bad thing. I would characterize it as being too uncritically uncritical about science. Of course, what I've done is to make it trivially true that scientism is a bad thing. The two does that for you. It's trivially true that scientism is a bad thing. It's a substantial question. What ideas about science constitute scientism? Right? That's a substantial and in some ways, I think, a very difficult question. And then I contrast this with cynicism, which I would characterize as being too uncritically critical of science, that's to say, far too willing to criticize any and every aspect of science and any and every scientist. Okay. And I could say I wanted to find a middle way. I think now I should perhaps point out something about myself. Right? It's clear to me now that I have always had a tendency to try to find the middle way in intellectual disputes. This is one of the reasons that I find myself so much in sympathy with the classical pragmatists, because they too characteristically sought to find a middle way, to find a continuity or a third way. I think it might also be wise to tell you a joke against myself, just to keep me honest. I guess this is too good to be true, but it really is good. It's a story about a student writing his introduction to philosophy examination, you know, the final exam in PHI 101. Faced with the inevitable question about the existence of God. There's always a question about the existence of God on Philosophy 101. And he writes, some philosophers think that God exists, and some philosophers think that God does not exist. But the truth, as so often, lies somewhere in between. I have to remember that. The truth doesn't always lie somewhere in between. Well, I'm going to try to describe a reasonable resolution of the conflict behind the science wars. Of course, it can be only a sketch. I did actually toy with a title about roadmaps to peace, but decided that no, that was probably, in the circumstances, I didn't know what would blow up by the time I got here. So, yeah. Okay. There will be 6 themes which I will take in turn. The first is the scientific enterprise. What is it? How should we think about it? What kind of thing is it? And the first thing I want to say about that is something about how we shouldn't think about it. There is in English, and also, so far as I've been able to discover, in every language with which I've managed to find an informant with whom I can intelligently discuss this, that they see the same phenomenon. Words like science, scientific, scientifically, have acquired, because of the successes of the sciences, because of the prestige of the scientific enterprise, they've acquired an honorific use. They've become sort of all-purpose terms of praise. So that if we're skeptical of something someone tells us, we might say, do you have any scientific evidence for that? And really, that's just a way of saying, do you have any good evidence for that? I don't know if you ever saw these advertisements, but there was a time in England when detergent manufacturers were making stuff they called biological detergent. Allegedly, it contained bacteria that ate the dirt. And there was a period when you couldn't get away from advertisements on the television where actors would show up in white coats with pockets with lots of pens in, looking scientific, and usually a label saying Dr. So-and-so. And they would say, buy new scientific Wizzo. It gets your clothes even cleaner. That's the honorific use of the word science. If I had the power, I would ban it. I don't, so I can't, but I can not use it, and I never use the word that way. Instead, I prefer to use the word science, or actually better, the sciences, to refer to a loose federation of kinds of inquiry. I think it's advisable not to think of science, as the singular noun encourages us to do, as a completely monolithic enterprise. But after all, there are enormous differences between, say, the work of astronomy and the work of sociology, or for that matter, between the work of astronomy and the work of molecular biology. I prefer the plural, and I think of it as picking out a fairly loosely connected federation of kinds of inquiry. A fairly loosely connected federation which, as the sciences advance, I think has got gradually more unified. I also think of scientific inquiry as continuous with ordinary, everyday inquiry. That's to say, as much more careful, much more detailed, much more rigorous, but not unrecognizably different from what, say, I do when, as sometimes happens, I will cook a dish once and it comes out really well, and then perhaps a month later I will cook it again and it's not so good. And then a third time I will rather self-consciously cook it and try to identify. Was it the onions weren't so good? The tomatoes weren't so good? Was it that I didn't brown the onions quite enough, or I browned them a little too much? I'm doing something recognizably like what a scientist might do. This, I might say, is not a new idea. It's an idea that would have been pretty unfashionable throughout most of the 20th century in philosophy of science, but actually it's not a new idea at all. Here are some of the people who said something very much like it before myself. This is Thomas Huxley. The Huxley family seems to be doing rather well tonight, doesn't it? With the amazing sideburns and what is, I think, a monkey skull. I don't know if you know this, they used to call Thomas Huxley Darwin's bulldog because he would fight so hard for Darwin's ideas, by which he was very soon and very early convinced. He writes, "The man of science simply uses with scrupulous exactness the methods which we all use carelessly." Percy Bridgman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and also a very, very thoughtful man who wrote a good deal of very interesting philosophy of science and some very interesting social commentary, including a paper called The Struggle for Intellectual Integrity, which I would recommend to all of you. He's on the right, by the way, in the midst of all this equipment. And he wrote that the most vital feature of the scientist's procedure has merely been to do the utmost with his mind. And, of course, Einstein, who at one point wrote, "The whole of science is nothing more than a refinement of everyday thinking." Let me tell you what this doesn't mean. I've called this view critical commonsensism, a phrase I borrowed from Peirce, one of the old pragmatists, and a phrase I very much like and which I think is very helpful, rightly understood, but I've seen an awful lot of people misunderstand what I meant. So perhaps I'd better say, I did not mean to say science is just common sense. That would be grossly false, not to mention an insult to the generations of scientists who have worked extremely hard to develop the knowledge we now have. Moreover, of course, some aspects of currently accepted scientific theories are really very unlike common sense. No doubt in part because what we think of as common sense ideas often has outdated science built into it. Nor do I mean anyone can be a scientist. Lord, I've had great difficulty with this thesis. A few years ago, I was a member of a panel at the Fordham Foundation, which looked at the science standards across the 50 states. I might say when I took this on, I had no idea what I was in for. I asked the chair roughly how many pages would I have to read. And he said, it'll be about 300 pages a state. And I figured, okay, that I can manage. Wrong. By 2005, it wasn't 300 pages a state. It was hypertext. And it was more like 3,000 pages a state. My garage is still full of these papers. But a lot of these state standards actually said things like, anyone can be a scientist. And I realized, well, this is not true. Of course it's true that it doesn't matter whether you're male or female or black or white or yellow or green or purple. That doesn't matter. But of course it does matter whether you have certain intellectual abilities. I think it also matters whether you have certain, I don't know what to call these, certain traits of intellectual character. I don't think I would ever have made a better than competent scientist, and truth to tell, I think the reason is it requires a lot of patience, more than I have for that kind of thing. So when I say I'm in sympathy with this old idea of Huxley, of Bridgman, of Einstein, I wish you wouldn't forget the phrases scrupulous exactness, doing your utmost with your mind, and a refinement of everyday thinking. Second issue, truth. Well, I take it that since the sciences are forms of inquiry, they do what all forms of inquiry do, they seek answers to questions. And if you're seeking the answer to a question, hey, you're seeking the true answer to a question. That's what it means to be seeking the answer. This, of course, doesn't mean that scientists seek the truth in big capital letters. And it especially doesn't mean that they're seeking, that one true proposition such that if you only get hold of that, then everything becomes clear. And it certainly doesn't mean that all scientific claims are true. I would guess that the vast majority of scientific claims that have been made in the past have turned out to be false. Nor does it mean that science is the only source of truth. Of course it isn't. There are all sorts of other kinds of truth, legal truths and literary truths and so on. Nor, of course, is it to say that scientific claims are known with certainty. All it means, and this is so simple, it's almost embarrassing to have to say it, but all it means is, if you're inquiring into whether P, where P is some proposition, what do you want? Well, you want to end up believing that P, if P, and not otherwise. For example, if you're trying to figure out what the structure of DNA is, well, you want to end up believing that DNA is a double helical backbone out macromolecule with like with unlike base pairs, if it is, and not that if it isn't. Of course, if you think about that last comment, that what you want is to believe that DNA is a double helical backbone out macromolecule with like with unlike base pairs. If DNA is a double helical backbone out macromolecule with like with unlike base pairs and not otherwise, that begins to explain why, as you see, I seem to be obsessed with detergent. I'm sorry about that. And I love the colors. But the point I'm trying to get across with this slide is that begins to explain why the truth works, because what it means is that the way you believe things to be is the way they are. I'm not the first person to say this, too. The first person to say this, at least recently, at least within living memory, was a philosopher called Frank Ramsey, who actually died at the age of 27. Having made a substantial contribution already. And he says, in this very context, the truth about truth is so banal that I feel funny sort of even saying it, but somebody's got to do it. What does it mean to say that a claim is true? Well, look, the belief that Smith is either a liar or a fool is true if Smith is either a liar or a fool and not otherwise. That's what it means. By the way, Frank Ramsey's brother subsequently became Archbishop of Canterbury, and I once heard Archbishop Ramsey say on the radio, of course, Frank got all the brains in my family. Okay, now let's talk about reality and objectivity for a little while. I'm sorry, pictures of concepts are actually rather hard to come by. Some truths, of course, are about us. It's true that I have what must sound in this room like a funny accent. Right? That's a truth about me. It was, by the way, 5 years into my time in Miami before I finally accepted it's I who have the accent. Some truths are about us, some truths are about things we make. They're about artifacts that we make, for example, or about books that we write, novels that we create with imaginary worlds that we create in novels. Some of them are even about physical phenomena which occur only in the laboratory. Nevertheless, it doesn't follow, and it's not true, that whether a claim is true depends on whether we believe it is. And that's what I mean when I say that truth is objective. And when I say there's one real world, I want to continue. Yes, of course, it's largely independent of us, but it's not wholly independent of us. Human beings can and do and have changed the world in many ways, some of them very significant. The sciences, I take it, aspire to describe this one real world, and when a scientific claim is true, what it describes is real. Of course, this is a very modest version of what Gross and Levitt said when they said science is a reality-based enterprise, because that suggests that anything that any scientist ever says is true and describes something that's real and objectively so. That's not what I've said. I've said when a scientific claim is true, what it describes is real. What about scientific evidence? I'm not using scientific evidence honorifically. It doesn't mean good evidence. The evidence on which scientific claims depend. What's special about it? Usually it's actively sought out. Occasionally it just comes to you, you get lucky. But usually you have to get off your rear end and go work to get it. The work may be a matter of designing a very complicated and subtle experiment to get the world to tell you the answer. Or it may be, I'm actually enormously impressed by this, it may be the kind of getting the evidence that was involved when Neil Shubin and his team of paleontologists took themselves to the Canadian Arctic, of all the awful places to go work. Every year, for 5 years, they went and they dug, and they dug, and they looked, and they looked, and every year, for years and years, they came back to Chicago. No luck, we'll have to go try again next year. And hey, finally in 2004, they find what they were looking for in the right geological layer. Fossilized remains of the Tiktaalik, that extraordinary creature which is the transitional form between the fish and the reptile, which would have looked when it had all its flesh just like a fish. But when you look at the skeleton in the, well, I'm saying shoulders, but of course fish shoulders, I don't really quite know what that means. Where the shoulders would be if it weren't a fish, it has bones like shoulder bones, and in even little things like little fingers. And in the rear, where its rear flippers are, they have bones, and they have bones which look remarkably like the ancestors of land animals. Okay. So actively sought out, sometimes at great personal cost. Usually not just raw, but mediated by instruments, which of course themselves introduce the possibility of mistake and certain kinds of error and misinterpretation. And usually not the possession of one person, but a shared resource. Moreover, awfully complicated, multidimensional, and not seldom ambiguous, confusing, hard to interpret. You don't quite know what it means. It doesn't bear its meaning on its face. And moreover, it ramifies all over the place. Think of the evidence for the theory of evolution. Think of the multiple intersecting lines of evidence. It structures a heck of a lot more like a crossword puzzle than it is like a chain, even though the epistemologist keeps talking, still, after all these years of my arguing against them, about chains of evidence. You've probably seen this in airline magazines, haven't you? They try to sell you the largest crossword in the world. The idea is you hang it on your bathroom wall and work on it while you're sitting there. Well, it may be the largest actual piece of paper crossword in the world, but the scientific crossword is so much bigger, right? It's just enormously, enormously, enormously bigger and enormously more complicated. And, of course, the clues are often deeply, deeply cryptic and require hard work or maybe genius to interpret. In consequence of the complexity of the evidence, and think of science as a process. It takes place over time, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And at any point in time, there are going to be some scientific claims which are really, really very well warranted indeed. You'd be really, really surprised if they turned out to be false. I was reading some students this afternoon the evolution disclaimer statement that the Dover, Pennsylvania Board of Education had read at the beginning of 9th grade biology. And one of the things that it says, it's a remarkable document. Remarkable, I'm afraid, for its stupidity, but anyway. One of the things that it says is that with respect to the theory of evolution, as with respect to any theory, students are encouraged to keep an open mind. Think about it. Keep an open mind about whether really the Earth rotates around the sun or the other way around. Keep an open mind about what would happen if you jump out of a 7-story building. Okay, so some scientific claims are really very, very solidly warranted indeed. It's not that they couldn't turn out false, but it's extremely unlikely. Others, however, are only rather much more weakly warranted, or fairly warranted, but we wouldn't be astounded if they turned out wrong. Some of them are highly speculative. Some of them are just downright wild and wacky. You know, they might pan out, but yeah, they might not. Some are sort of flaky, you know, half-baked. I think my culinary metaphor is getting a bit out of control, but anyway. And some are, of course, fraudulent. Henry Bauer, who was in an earlier incarnation a chemist by profession, and then went into science and technology studies, and I think is one of the most interesting of the STS practitioners of his time, wrote a very fascinating book called Scientific Literacy and the Myth of Scientific Method, in which he presents this really very nice diagram of the filter of scientific knowledge, where all sorts of dotty ideas go in at the top, but various stages of review to see whether you can get a grant, review to see whether it will be published in a journal, review to see whether it's worth abstracting, more scrutiny by the whole community to decide whether it's worth putting in the textbooks, and then the solidest stuff, if you can read the small print, is what's in the textbooks of the future. What about scientific method? I guess this is probably the most radical of my theses. It's certainly the one that gets me yelled at most often. I don't think there is such a thing as the scientific method. Not as it's ordinarily understood, that is. Not as to say a method used by all scientists and only by scientists and explaining the successes of the sciences. What I think there is the method that's used by anybody who's seriously trying to figure something out, which of course is not used only by scientists, it's also used by historians, by detectives, by legal scholars, by plumbers trying to figure out why your loo is backing up or whatever. And specialized scientific techniques for example, getting hold of evidence or interpreting evidence, etc., which, however, are specialized enough, and of course which develop over time, so they are not the scientific. What's special about it? Usually it's actively sought out. Occasionally it just comes to you, you get lucky. But usually you have to get off your rear end and go work to get it. The work may be a matter of designing a very complicated and subtle experiment to get the world to tell you the answer. Or it may be, I'm actually enormously impressed by this, it may be the kind of getting the evidence that was involved when Neil Shubin and his team of paleontologists took themselves to the Canadian Arctic, of all the awful places to go work. Every year, for 5 years, they went and they dug, and they dug, and they looked, and they looked, and every year, for years and years, they came back to Chicago. No luck, we'll have to go try again next year. And hey, finally in 2004, they find what they were looking for in the right geological layer. Fossilized remains of the Tiktaalik, that extraordinary creature which is the transitional form between the fish and the reptile, which would have looked when it had all its flesh just like a fish. But when you look at the skeleton in the, well, I'm saying shoulders, but of course fish shoulders, I don't really quite know what that means. Where the shoulders would be if it weren't a fish. It has bones like shoulder bones, and in even little things like little fingers. And in the rear, where its rear flippers are, they have bones, and they have bones which look remarkably like the ancestors of land animals. Okay. So actively sought out, sometimes at great personal cost. Usually not just raw, but mediated by instruments, which of course themselves introduce the possibility of mistake and certain kinds of error and misinterpretation. And usually not the possession of one person, but a shared resource. Moreover, awfully complicated, multidimensional, and not seldom ambiguous, confusing, hard to interpret. You don't quite know what it means. It doesn't bear its meaning on its face. And moreover, it ramifies all over the place. Think of the evidence for the theory of evolution. Think of the multiple intersecting lines of evidence. It structures a heck of a lot more like a crossword puzzle than it is like a chain, even though epistemologists keeps talking still, after all these years of my arguing against them, about chains of evidence. You've probably seen this in airline magazines, haven't you? They try to sell you the largest crossword in the world. The idea is you hang it on your bathroom wall and work on it while you're sitting there. Well, it may be the largest actual piece of paper crossword in the world, but the scientific crossword is so much bigger, right? It's just enormously, enormously, enormously bigger and enormously more complicated. And of course, the clues are often deeply, deeply cryptic and require hard work or maybe genius to interpret. In consequence of the complexity of the evidence, and think of science as a process. It takes place over time, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And at any point in time, there are going to be some scientific claims which are really, really very well warranted indeed. You'd be really, really surprised if they turned out to be false. I was reading some students this afternoon the evolution disclaimer statement that the Dover, Pennsylvania Board of Education had read at the beginning of 9th grade biology. And one of the things that it says, it's a remarkable document. Remarkable, I'm afraid, for its stupidity, but anyway. One of the things that it says is that with respect to the theory of evolution, as with respect to any theory, students are encouraged to keep an open mind. Think about it. Keep an open mind about whether really the Earth rotates around the sun or the other way around. Keep an open mind about what would happen if you jump out of a 7-story building. Okay, so some scientific claims are really very, very solidly warranted indeed. It's not that they couldn't turn out false, but it's extremely unlikely. Others, however, are only rather much more weakly warranted, or fairly warranted, but we wouldn't be astounded if they turned out wrong. Some of them are highly speculative. Some of them are just downright wild and wacky. You know, they might pan out, but yeah, they might not. Some are sort of flaky, you know, half-baked. I think my culinary metaphor is getting a bit out of control, but anyway. And some are, of course, fraudulent. Henry Bauer, who was in an earlier incarnation a chemist by profession, and then went into science and technology studies, and I think is one of the most interesting of the STS practitioners of his time, wrote a very fascinating book called Scientific Literacy and the Myth of Scientific Method, in which he presents this really very nice diagram of the filter of scientific knowledge, where all sorts of dotty ideas go in at the top, but various stages of review to see whether you can get a grant, review to see whether it will be published in a journal, review to see whether it's worth abstracting, more scrutiny by the whole community to decide whether it's worth putting in the textbooks, and then the solidest stuff, if you can read the small print, is what's in the textbooks of the future. What about scientific method? I guess this is probably the most radical of my theses. It's certainly the one that gets me yelled at most often. I don't think there is such a thing as the scientific method. Not as it's ordinarily understood, that is. Not as to say a method used by all scientists and only by scientists and explaining the successes of the sciences. What I think there is the method that's used by anybody who's seriously trying to figure something out, which of course is not used only by scientists, it's also used by historians, by detectives, by legal scholars, by plumbers trying to figure out why your loo is backing up or whatever. And specialized scientific techniques for example, getting hold of evidence or interpreting evidence, etc., which, however, are specialized enough, and of course which develop over time, so they are not the scientific method because they're not used by all scientists. What sort of things I mean? Okay, what's the method of empirical inquiry? Make an informed guess. Figure out its consequences and check out how well those consequences stand up to the evidence you have, and, this is really important, any evidence you can get. Right? You're not a serious empirical inquirer if all you're doing is sort of churning over the information you happen to have already, and you're not willing to get up and go out and see what else there is to be found out if you put your mind to it. And then there are specialized scientific techniques. These are very often local to some field. I mean, I think I could fairly say that by and large and on the whole, molecular biology is not going to have much use for a telescope. And an astronomer is not going to have much use for a questionnaire. But these are actually useful specialized helps in their appropriate area. These are always evolving, and they always depend either on earlier techniques or sometimes on theoretical knowledge. I think more rarely on theoretical knowledge. They're often the result of very clever tinkering. Francis Bacon, who was, well, he was Chancellor of England. That's roughly the equivalent of Attorney General. I believe he got the job because he was the only candidate who was willing to torture suspects if need be. Perhaps not entirely irrelevant, perhaps not just a joke. I mean, I'm not telling you this just to be funny. Because when he writes about science, and he was a sort of visionary about what science could be in a day when science was barely, modern science was barely beginning. He sometimes writes about putting nature on the rack. What he means is you may have to, as it were, torture nature to get her to give up the answer. You may have to conduct a complicated experiment to get the answer that you need. He called these special techniques helps to inquiry, an expression I have borrowed. They include helps to obtaining evidence. I'd put on that list experimental design, experimental controls. Often very subtle, very complex, requiring both knowledge, ingenuity, intelligence. Microscopes, telescopes, questionnaires. And the important thing is all of these gradually improve. On the left you have a sort of familiar kind of microscope. Is it on your left? Yes, it is on your left. And on the right, an electron microscope. Of course, we didn't go straight from one to the next. It was a gradual process. And then again, familiar sort of telescope, such as you might see on board a ship, I guess, and a radio telescope. These helps to inquiry, gradually as science develops, get more and more sophisticated, capable of telling us, of getting more and more evidence for us. Then there are helps to reasoning. Numerals. Heck of a lot easier reasoning using numerals than it is using, say, a stick on which you cut notches every time one of the sheep you're counting goes by. The calculus, without which Newtonian physics would have been impossible. Statistical techniques. Think of all the umpty-ump ways of measuring statistical significance, for example. Actually, we shouldn't forget that another help to reasoning is the computer. There on the left is a big old computer, and on the right was the smallest one I could find on the internet. As you can see, it's about the size of a ballpoint pen. I don't know if you know this, but I should tell you. Before the word computer referred to the machines which are now familiar, part of our everyday lives, it used to refer as late as early in the scientific, because they're not used by all scientists. What sort of things I mean? Okay, what's the method of empirical inquiry? Make an informed guess. Figure out its consequences and check out how well those consequences stand up to the evidence you have and, this is really important, any evidence you can get. Right? You're not a serious empirical inquirer if all you're doing is sort of churning over the information you happen to have already, and you're not willing to get up and go out and see what else there is to be found out if you put your mind to it. And then there are specialized scientific techniques. These are very often local to some field. I mean, I think I could fairly say that by and large and on the whole, molecular biology is not going to have much use for a telescope. And an astronomer is not going to have much use for a questionnaire. But these are actually useful specialized helps in their appropriate area. These are always evolving, and they always depend either on earlier techniques or sometimes on theoretical knowledge. I think more rarely on theoretical knowledge. They're often the result of very clever tinkering. Francis Bacon, who was, well, he was Chancellor of England. That's roughly the equivalent of Attorney General. I believe he got the job because he was the only candidate who was willing to torture suspects if need be. Perhaps not entirely irrelevant, perhaps not just a joke. I mean, I'm not telling you this just to be funny. Because when he writes about science, and he was a sort of visionary about what science could be in a day when science was barely, modern science was barely beginning. He sometimes writes about putting nature on the rack. What he means is you may have to, as it were, torture nature to get her to give up the answer. You may have to conduct a complicated experiment to get the answer that you need. He called these special techniques helps to inquiry, an expression I have borrowed. They include helps to obtaining evidence. I'd put on that list experimental design, experimental controls, often very subtle, very complex, requiring both knowledge, ingenuity, intelligence. Microscopes, telescopes, questionnaires. And the important thing is all of these gradually improve. On the left you have a sort of familiar kind of microscope. Is it on your left? Yes, it is on your left. And on the right, an electron microscope. Of course, we didn't go straight from one to the next. It was a gradual process. And then again, familiar sort of telescope, such as you might see on board a ship, I guess, and a radio telescope. These helps to inquiry, gradually as science develops, get more and more sophisticated, capable of telling us, of getting more and more evidence for us. Then there are helps to reasoning. Numerals. Heck of a lot easier reasoning using numerals than it is using, say, a stick on which you cut notches every time one of the sheep you're counting goes by. The calculus, without which Newtonian physics would have been impossible. Statistical techniques. Think of all the umpty-ump ways of measuring statistical significance, for example. Actually, we shouldn't forget that another help to reasoning is the computer. There on the left is a big old computer, and on the right was the smallest one I could find on the internet. As you can see, it's about the size of a ballpoint pen. I don't know if you know this, but I should tell you. Before the word computer referred to the machines which are now familiar, part of our everyday lives, it used to refer, as late as early in the Second World War, to the women who were employed by the Ministry of Defence in England to calculate the trajectories of artillery. The men were at war, so it was the women who were doing the arithmetic, and they were called computers. And the word was borrowed for the machines which were then being devised that would do this quicker and more accurately than they. From a 15-year-old boy who was a student at Oxford, and used to be, this is in the time of the Tudors. In the time of the Tudors, he would be a student at Oxford, really quite young. He was 15. And he'd written home to his father a letter which could have been written by any student today. Dear Dad, I want to come home. I can't do this. It's too hard. I am going to flunk. Can I please come home? I really don't want to be in the university. Could I come home? Please, please. What was it was so hard? Long division in Roman numerals. I can sort of do that, but how do I do it? I translate it into Arabic, of course. Okay. Then there are helps to the imagination. Metaphors. I should know about that. I've been playing with the crossword metaphor for a long time now. Very, very good it's been too. I now think of it as like a pet dog. You know, I take it out of an evening and see where it takes me. And then models. The picture here is of Watson and Crick's model for the structure of DNA, the one of which, interestingly enough, Watson said, as soon as he saw it, I realized it was too pretty not to be true. Well, yeah. It's very important that this is not just a help to envisaging this thing in 3 dimensions, which is not an easy thing to do. It's also an evidential check. The thing with which Crick is pointing is the measuring device that they were using to make sure that there was actually room for all the component stuff. This is built to scale to a high degree of rigor. Of course, you're probably more familiar with modern pictures of DNA like these, or this one I particularly like because, of course, this gives one a sense of what we now know, that it matters not simply how the thing is constructed, but also how it's folded in the cell. I don't know if you know this, but mad cow disease is apparently caused by protein molecules which are wrongly folded in the cell. And this I simply couldn't resist. The model of DNA has now become such a cultural icon that you see it in some really very amusing forms. The one on the left is knitted, and the one on the right is Lego. These are not, of course, serious scientific models, but they show how this has entered the cultural consciousness. Okay. Then there are helps to honesty and hard work and such. You know, all that elaborate training and all those incentives and all the disincentives which help to instill, well, what? What are the virtues you really want of a scientist? I think Robert Merton, the great sociologist of science, had this right a long time ago. Respect for evidence, which Merton called disinterestedness, and willingness to share the evidence you have with others working in the field. He called that, rather unfortunately, communism. Then there are disincentives to discourage cheating, fraud, secrecy, withholding evidence. Now, here's my thesis about what's happening at the moment. Seems to me the technical helps just keep getting better and better and better. It's just stunning how they get better and better and better. But I think the social helps are coming under increasing strain, because as science progresses, it gets more expensive. Why? Well, in part because you've got the cheap results already, and in part because, especially in physics, as you get closer and closer to the cutting edge, you need to move particles, smaller and smaller particles, faster and faster, and that's very expensive indeed. So when science becomes more expensive, it's no longer possible to do it with a candle and a piece of string. You know, you need expensive equipment, and you need assistance, and you need time. The only sorts of bodies that can afford to support it are commercial interests, big industrial concerns, and governments. And of course, both of those have other interests besides discovering the truth, interests which I think pose a real threat to the values of science. What about progress? Well, I would say nothing succeeds like success. Still, progress varies with time and with field, and it's not always, it's certainly not a matter of every step there's progress, but it may be a matter of a better theory. It may be a matter not of a better theory, but just of better concepts, better terminology for describing the world. Without, for example, the concept of a macromolecule, which, when it was introduced, was so controversial. Right? This poor man had this idea that there were some molecules which were not only big, but not just their composition, but their structure in 3 dimensions mattered to what they were and what they did. That was the concept of a macromolecule. Of course, we now know DNA is such a molecule. When he first introduced this idea, it was at a conference in Switzerland, German-speaking Switzerland. And he suggested this idea from the platform. And everybody in the audience said, yeah, what a silly idea. We don't need that. And he was actually reduced by the end of the conference to standing on his chair and saying, just like Martin Luther, hier stehe ich kann nicht anders. Here I stand, I can do no other. He was, of course, right. So, novel concepts, novel experimental design, new special techniques, and so on. Progress comes in many shapes and forms. It's sometimes very fast. It's sometimes agonizingly slow and agonizingly painful. And there is absolutely no guarantee that the sciences will always progress. There is no guarantee that some area or some field or even the whole thing could never stagnate or even go backwards. And now I think I can summarize. Epistemological values are at the core of science, but political and commercial values can interfere. Okay, so I'm trying to give there's something right about each side. It's very like a wall. Epistemological values are at the core of science. But it is kind of like a snake. Political and commercial values may interfere. Yeah, it's very like a tree. The legs are very like it. The truth of the scientific claim does depend on how the world is. But of course, yes, scientific concepts are scientists' intellectual creation. They are created, constructed by this social institution of science. And again, truth is objective, yeah, but not all scientists are objective. Some scientists are biased. Perhaps all scientists are biased in some degree. Luckily, not all of them in the same direction. Scientific claims are, some of them better and some of them worse warranted. But evidence doesn't carry its message on its face. It can be ambiguous. It can be potentially misleading. Yes, science shows what man can achieve if he really puts his mind to it. You know, it is one of the most remarkable achievements of the human mind. I feel sort of proud of belonging to the race that can do this. And knowledge of the world really can help us control or avoid some dangers or some difficulties or some infirmities. That doesn't mean that some scientific discoveries are not very disturbing. It must have been very disturbing to discover that the Earth was not the center of the universe. As some people still find it disturbing to discover that we are not the chosen creatures, we are a product of evolution like other creatures. And, of course, some scientific discoveries can be and have been misused for bad ends. Who could deny it? Now, I hope, a real elephant. Thank you.
Microphones there. If you have questions on any of this, all of this, comments, whatever.
Maybe a little more light in the...
Yeah, bring the lights up a little bit, and the audience lights up. Light person.
Because it's...
Light person.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead over here.
Okay.
It's good. You don't. Yeah.
So
You'll adjust.
Oh, weird. It's really weird to hear your voice echo through the schnitz. But it's my humble opinion that I think that you have forgotten a part of your elephant.
A what?
A part of your elephant.
Uh-huh.
And that, the metaphor what I would use is the eyes.
Okay.
What I'm trying to point out is that in your definition of empirical inquiry, I think something that you overlooked was the question. So you propose a theory, but really before the first step is forming the question. And I really think that's what defines science, because you have to form a question that can be answered with the tools that you have. For instance, like a question like, is this cat blue, or something like that. But a question that can't be answered is like, does God exist, or something like that.
Okay. I'm quite sure that what I could describe in an hour wasn't the whole elephant. That goes without saying. Okay. I simply couldn't resist the last slide, right? Because
of course, yeah, no, I understand.
Such a magnificent animal and such big feet. And okay. Of course, I think yes, it's a precondition of any kind of directed inquiry that you formulate to yourself a question to begin with. I would want to add, it's very important that you not set your question in stone, because one possible conclusion as you try to answer a question, one conclusion is that the answer is this, another is the answer is that. But another possibility is, oh, darn, that was not really a good question. Sometimes the problem is as simple as, to consider the question, have you stopped beating your wife? Okay. Now, if you don't have a wife, or if you have a wife but you never beat her, then it would be a mistake to try to answer that question. Okay. That's the question with false presuppositions. That's the problem. And sometimes that turns out to be the correct response, not an answer to the question, but repudiate the question as resting on false presuppositions. I actually think that that's a very common phenomenon with metaphysical questions. It's not that metaphysics is essentially meaningless, it's that many of the questions that metaphysicians have preoccupied themselves with have false presuppositions and thus are confused questions. So far, I don't think we disagree. There is a point at which I think perhaps we might, and that's worth bringing out. You said a question that can be answered with the resources available to you. I would say a question that's not in principle unanswerable, but you may find, you ask a question, it's not a bad question, it doesn't have false presuppositions, it's a meaningful question. But nevertheless, it's not soluble with the resources you have, and in order to solve it, you may need to invent new resources. Right? I'm thinking that there were questions about, say, what's the hereditary material? Right? Which would have been perfectly good questions before the concept of macromolecule was introduced, but were not answerable even with the conceptual resources, forget the other resources available at the time. The moral I think I draw from your question is, besides, yes, it would have been nice to say, first you have a question, is there are some really quite deep issues about what constitutes a proper question, an in principle okay question. What constitutes a question that we're inclined to call scientific as opposed to something else? That's tricky. And what constitutes a question which is in principle unanswerable versus one which is not answerable from here without some intermediary steps we haven't yet even imagined? Okay. I'd kind of like to do that. It strikes me as a good
Wouldn't
path.
the question be then, how do we answer this question?
Yeah, there would be another question. How do we go about it? What would we need to know?
Yes.
Right,
so
well,
I think,
yeah.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is very, not that big a deal. It's basically that your slide was wrong.
Well, it's basically that if I were clever enough to give you that elephant with a bit missing,
yeah.
Right.
I just want to say...
This was the absolute limit of my technological skills, so...
Okay. I just want to say one thing, and I'll give up the mic. I think there are two more steps in empirical inquiry. What's my question? What am I trying to answer? And is my question right? Or is it the right question? Or should I ask something else? Okay,
yes. My sense is the right question for what?
That's another question.
Yeah, right, okay.
Thank you, Doctor. The program notes in your presentation suggest some very large ideas. What is science? And what I consider to be an important contemporary question, what is anti-science? To me, I could never understand an idea of anti-science until recently, and it became manifest, and I hope a tide has turned. There's a magic in science and a magic in language. There's a poetry between the two that your program touches on two ways. I offer a third, would be the language on the Voyager spacecraft that describes the hydrogen molecule, the oxygen molecule, and the carbon molecule, a man and a woman's vision. The second would be the DNA molecule. You noted that's where I closed my thought. I dropped the third idea.
You're right. I'm trying to do something. I suppose it's ludicrously ambitious, but you know, once a question grabs you, it grabs you, and you know, I worry it until I feel a bit better about it, at least. One of the things I'm trying to understand is not only the continuity of the sciences with other kinds of inquiry, though that interests me a lot, right? But also the continuities between inquiry and other kinds of thing that human beings do. For example, if you think about what's involved in writing a novel, certain aspects of this are also seen in the work of a scientist. And you know, imagine some possible scenario. Right? Where it becomes different is what the novelist must do is explore it imaginatively, develop it, whereas what a scientist must do sooner or later is go out and find out whether this will hold up in the face of the evidence. Right? But I am interested in this sort of science as a cultural phenomenon, and I think it's important to, in order to persuade the people who are deeply hostile to the scientific enterprise that it's a mistake to be hostile in the way that they are, to get them to see that it's not, as it were, a sort of isolated priestly kind of thing that only the elect can do or understand, but that it uses human capacities that we all have.
I recall your third example offered of pure science and pure language was the reference to the Arabic numeral, the adoption of which from the Muslim world, 1,300, 1,400 years ago, today allows most mathematical expressions to be instantly recognized by 95% of the world's population of scientists. That's right. That's pure magic. That's pure language. That's science.
Well,
thank you.
It's extraordinary. It's wonderful. It makes one realize, you know, the power of not simply concepts, but even of notation, of expression. Right? But it's not magic in the sense that it's incomprehensible. Okay, that's enough.
Thanks a lot for your talk tonight. Could you expand a bit on the social consequences of the hostility towards science that you've been talking about?
Yes. Well, I think partly I have to be concerned because I work in a university. I teach students actually in 2 schools, but from across the College of Arts and Sciences. Every year I teach an interdisciplinary class designed to take in students from different degrees. And I think one consequence of this kind of hostility, which some students have learned in, you know, some branches of the university, is a sort of unnecessary blindness to science. They get the idea they can't possibly understand it. You know, it's opaque. It's not for people like them. And I think that means that this is a dangerous position to be in. It's a much better position to be in, to realize, it's complicated. It might take me a long time to get up to speed and understand it exactly. But it's not inherently unintelligible to the likes of me. Okay, so from the point of view of education, I think it matters a lot that I can try to cure them of just blanket hostility. The scientists I know worry a lot that this kind of hostility will result in squeezing their funding. I don't know how justified that fear is, but they are very concerned about that. And of course, the critics reply, you're just defending the enterprise because you want to get more money out of us. I think at the back of this, okay, there is a serious issue about which I've said nothing tonight and which I think is very, very hard. And that is, if it's, so to speak, public money which is being used to fund science, as in large measure it is, not by no means wholly, because of course there's a lot of industrial money going into it. But to the extent that it is, the people who supply that money, that's to say the taxpayers, you and I, rightly feel some concern about whether the money is being well spent. And rightly, I think, feel sort of uneasy when scientists say to them, well, you wouldn't understand, just trust me. Right? This is a very good use for $1 gazillion. You wouldn't understand if I tried to explain it. Trust me. I mean, I understand why people feel sort of uneasy about that. But on the other hand, I also think that it's true that if you put all the money where, okay, if you simply put the money in the areas where the man in the street can see why you would want to know that and how it would benefit him if you did, right, you may end up wasting a lot of it because you put it where scientists in the field could tell you, we're not going to get that answer yet. We have to do this thing which looks sort of off the track. Okay. Then I'll mention one other concern. This is a concern that I encounter as, in wearing my law professor hat. I teach a class on scientific testimony. And one of the issues that comes up there again and again and again is that the parties to a case will be bringing in expert witnesses who will testify on behalf of one side or the other. And ordinarily, once the case goes to court, they will testify. There'll be people on both sides testifying, experts on both sides. And then somebody who is not a scientist at all, who is not remotely as qualified as any of these experts in the field in question, whether it be a judge or whether it be a jury, has to decide which of them is right. And this makes me care a great deal about scientific literacy in the general population, because to the extent that science is made to seem a mystery and perhaps even a threatening mystery, we will get more and more of a gap between the people who are making the fact-finding decisions and the experts who are produced to tell them what the story is.
I'm a 6th grader in Westland, and when you told us the poem about the blind men and the elephant, for some reason I was sure that one of the blind men would come along and say, well, the elephant is all of the things. And I was wondering if you knew of any, groups or books or just a person who thinks that it's both. And I know you talked a little bit about yourself trying to find the middle ground, and I was wondering if you could touch back on that.
Yes, okay. Am I alone? No, right? Am I, what can I say? Am I the mainstream? Probably not, no. I think something happened in philosophy of science in the last 50 years or so, which I think was unfortunate. Well, I see why it happened, but I think it was unfortunate. It's in part a consequence of increased specialization within philosophy. When I was coming up, most of the philosophers I knew were interested in at least several overlapping areas of philosophy. As time has worn on, more and more and more younger people seem to be only interested in this one area, or even in this one sub-area of this area, right? So that rather than being interested in, say, logic and philosophy of logic and philosophy of language and how that interrelates with the philosophy of mind, I actually meet people who say, well, my specialty in philosophy is paraconsistent logic, which is, about 3% of one of those areas. So one consequence of this was that philosophy of science became a specialty. And in particular, it grew to be an entirely separate specialty from epistemology. Epistemology, I'm sorry, it's a horrible word. Jonathan Rauch, who's a young journalist who wrote a very nice book about speech codes in universities, has the marvelous line, if you want to empty a room at a cocktail party, say epistemology. They'll all run, right? It's an ugly word, but what it means is theory of knowledge. And I think I was very fortunate that I was working on epistemology for many years before I ever wrote anything about philosophy of science. But I was thinking about knowledge and about inquiry and about evidence in a general way, and then came to think about the sciences. Philosophers of science who have only ever specialized in the sciences don't have that background. And I think that's why I feel a bit out of the mainstream, because they're talking only to each other, and I'm talking this funny epistemological way that they're not familiar with. And of course the epistemologists don't want to listen to me because they don't do philosophy of science. So I think that's roughly what's happened. I am sort of encouraged by the, okay, this is interesting, I guess. It's interesting to me, I hope it is to you. When I wrote Defending Science and when it was first published, it got quite a lot of attention, but it got a lot more sympathetic attention from thoughtful scientists in all sorts of areas than it did from philosophers of science. And I finally figured out what the philosophers of science were peeved about when one of them wrote a review of the book in the Philosophical Review. And his big complaint was, all the philosophers of science she discusses are dead. i.e., she doesn't talk about us. Right? This is really annoying. She doesn't talk about us. That was a conscious decision on my part, I might say. I thought there was more to be learned by going backwards than by looking at the recent stuff. But what this taught me was, I'd been trying to understand the scientific enterprise, to describe the whole elephant, and to do it in a way that scientific colleagues would recognize and would say, yes, this is not a totally artificial picture. This is, I understand what you're saying, and it sounds right to me. That happened to a gratifying extent. The response of the philosophy of science establishment was fairly cool and remains so. That's okay with me.
So, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I definitely liked the lecture. It sounded like you were just really just scratching the surface on this, but and I like your, what I would call your ecumenical sensibility. Would that be the right term?
Okay, I like it. Yes.
Okay. Well, I know that two groups, there's philosophers and there's scientists. They're not the only groups, but they're two kind of big groups that they seem to be in agreement on approaching the questions using our reason, but they're still very much at cross purposes a lot of times, it seems, or they're speaking just a different language. And my favorite example, or one favorite example, would be like the the Schrodinger's cat example. And I'm coming at this from a from the standpoint of a philosopher who, along with a lot of other people, just are baffled by what the Schrodinger's cat thing says. And hearing physicists explain it doesn't really help matters either. I'm just wondering if you have some idea or advice as to how, in such a case, philosophers and scientists could come together to speak a language that reconciles, where each of them are coming from.
Yes, I'm inclined to say, there's no substitute for patience. You have to be prepared to talk to each other, and it will take as long as it takes.